Okay, welcome everyone to this seminar series on China and the world, which is a lunchtime monthly seminar series organized by LSE-Fudan Global Public Policy Hub. My name is Bingchun Meng. I'm a professor in the Department of Media Communications at LSE, and I'm also the director of the public policy, LSE-Fudan Public Policy Hub. So today we will hear from Dr. Tanvi Deshpande, who will be talking about the role of institutions in urban climate governance, learnings from the Global South. So Tanvi is a research fellow at the Fudan Public Policy Hub. Her research, primarily qualitative, has focused on cities, climate governance, and justice in the Global South. As a researcher from the Global South, she hopes to find comparison between diverse geographies and develop urban climate governance frameworks appropriate for the Global South. So we have scheduled an hour for this seminar in total, and Tanvi will probably talk between 35-40 minutes. We will make sure to leave ample time for Q&A. So Tanvi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Bingchun. Just 1 second, we are trying to avoid an echo. Hi, thank you so much for the introduction. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time to join the seminar. I am Tanvi Deshpande, and as Bingchun mentioned, I am a research fellow with the LSE-Fudan Hub, which is hosted by the School of Public Policy. I have been trained in political science, and my work really has focused on urban institutions and climate change, particularly in the Global South. And what I'm going to be doing today is going to briefly tell you about my own PhD research and my ongoing research as a postdoctoral fellow, both of which are really connected to how urban institutions are kind of working or trying to address climate issues in the Global South. So very quickly, an outline of my presentation. I'm going to briefly give you a context of why are cities, especially in the Global South, important from a climate change perspective. And then I'll talk about my PhD research, which really connects and shapes my ongoing research as a postdoc. And then I have some references that I have used in my slide. So very briefly, why are cities of the Global South important? Firstly, today, more than 50% of the global population is living in cities, and cities are contributing to about 70% of greenhouse gas emissions globally, and they're also globally contributing to 70% of the GDP. However, when it comes to cities of the Global South, they have weak governance mechanisms, which leads to service deficits. And there is, when I say service deficits, there is a serious mismatch between the demand and the supply. And this is kind of manifesting in various sectors at the city level. And in terms of climate change, cities of the Global South are extremely vulnerable to climate change impacts. And just some of those examples, and I've given examples of recent years where cities are experiencing floods. So for instance, the 2022 floods in Pakistan, or there are water scarcity and urban droughts. So for example, the Temeke district in close to Dar es Salaam experienced a severe drought in 2022. And increasingly, many cities are experiencing heat waves or heat island effects. And one of the examples was Sanbao in China recorded temperatures over 50 degrees. So very quickly, some of the key treaties or international treaties and conventions like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the New Urban Agenda, the Paris Agreement, and the Sendai Frameworks, all these international conventions have in recent years really brought cities in the spotlight, and this has shaped increasingly a lot of work on cities and climate change. So now very quickly about my own research and my PhD research. So I was trying to understand how urban institutions really address climate change by taking certain actions. And what I'm going to do very quickly is going to go through my research focus, some examples of the case study and the findings from a climate change perspective, and the conceptual frameworks and the causal mechanisms that kind of emerged or kind of were more defined after my fieldwork. Very quickly, urban climate governance is framed through three key questions. Firstly, how can cities act, especially in the global south? Who is involved in kind of pursuing climate action at the city level? And more recently, scholarship is now starting to think about, so what about urban climate action in the global south? So in terms of how cities act, a lot of the scholarship has tried to understand both the policy level and the project level or the intervention level measures that cities have taken to kind of address climate change. In terms of the actors involved, people have tried to understand the constellation of actors, which is basically an urban ecosystem that comprises of domestic actors and international actors that operate at different levels of the governance scales. And more recently now, people are thinking about how these urban climate actions are kind of now, what does it mean for a city? Is it kind of causing existing structural imbalances within the city? And what are the next steps that cities can do now that they have really understood how to act and who are the different actors who are involved? So my PhD work really focused on the first two questions. And so how can cities act and who's really involved in addressing climate action? And one of the cases that I studied was a small city. When I say small, it's a 1 million+ city, but it's a relatively smaller city because it's a secondary city, which is really understudied and under-theorized as compared to the mega or the large metropolitan cities. So this city is located in the west of India. And the city had taken several climate actions. They were both at the project level and at policy levels. And these actions were, or policies were either adaptation focused or mitigation focused. And they were also very sector specific. So, having policies or projects that were either focused on transport, energy, water, health, so different sectors. But in 2019, the city then decided to introduce a climate resilient action plan, which really is a policy, climate level policy that comprises of both adaptation and mitigation measures, and that speaks to different sectors at the urban level. In terms of the different actors involved, what I found was that there were both domestic level actors and state and international level actors. In terms of the domestic actors, the most important actor was the municipal government or the city government. Whereas at the international level, what I found was broadly, there were international non-governmental organizations that have maybe regional offices or bases that are headquartered in South Asia or India. And there were also these major donor agencies like the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation or the UN Development, UNDP, that were really funding these projects or policies at the city level. So in this case, it was the Rajkot city. And what I found was that the urban institutions was extremely important in making or shaping these climate policy processes at the local level. And now I'll kind of explain to you the conceptual framework that I used that really helped me understand how urban institutions kind of pursue climate action. So since I was trying to understand policy making and how urban institutions act, I used a state-centric theory, and I have used the state capacity concept. And state capacity is really defined as the ability of the state or the government to really implement its defined goals or policies. And usually these have been defined through different dimensions. So the extractive capacity of the state, the ability of the state to collect taxes, or the coercive capacity of the state, the ability of the state to kind of maintain internal order and protect it from external threat. And the final element or the dimension is the administrative capacity, which is the ability of the state to really develop policies and provide public services. So my work really relates to the third element, which is the administrative capacity of the state. However, what I found was in literature is that all these dimensions were really understood through a materialistic explanation or lens, which means that the state is really driven by its interest to generate revenues. So the state was really just interested in building its political power or military power, or was just interested in improving its fiscal needs or addressing its fiscal needs. And I felt that these explanations were falling short in kind of explaining the phenomenons that I found on my field sites. So I tried to shape this definition of state capacity using an ideational lens. When I say ideational, I was really trying to understand how are the policymakers, what are the values and the beliefs that these policymakers have, and how are they changing, especially in favor of climate change. So I traced how their ideas were kind of being shaped and influenced and evolving, and how that change in ideas within these governments or these urban institutions really improve their capacity to pursue climate action. And I'll now explain to you how did I really trace this ideational evolution within the state. So my causal mechanism, which really connects my independent variable with my dependent variable, helped me understand how do ideas or how does the thinking within the state change. And I used Hugh Heclo's framework of learning, puzzling, and powering. And what I found was a combination of all these three processes, which really relate to policy making. All these three processes collectively led to a change or an evolution in the thinking of the state. Very briefly, I'll explain to you what these three kind of processes are. Learning, which is the first element, really involves kind of an evaluation of the previous policies, and that helps define what is the policy problem today. In terms of the different actors involved, what I found was international organizations like the non-governmental organizations, which was in this case ICLE, which is based out of Germany in Bonn. They were really working with the municipal government, especially the bureaucratic arm of the government, to think about all the existing climate action plans and the measures that they had in place, and how could they kind of define a policy that can be much more resilient and comprehensive in the future. The second element or the process was puzzling, which really involved collective deliberations over policy choices. So now that you've understood and defined the policy problem, how can we now address this problem? So this was really a collective process, and that led to identification of policy solutions, which really led to defining a policy proposal. In this process, what I found was the urban institutions were very important. And as you can see now, it was much more state-centric. So both the bureaucratic and the political arm, that is the mayor's office, were very involved in this process. Finally, the third process was sparring, which is really, now that we have a proposal, how are we going to make this proposal? How are we going to adopt this policy and implement it? This means that it requires adequate support of people who have the power to do this. And this leads to policy adoption. And in this process, what I found was the mayor's office or the political arm was extremely important. So this is just a brief overview of what I kind of studied in my PhD and the findings of my PhD. And this really relates now to what I am going to be doing in my postdoctoral research. So before, I was trying to understand how urban institutions kind of pursue climate action. Now, the next step for me is to really understand how do urban institutions really interact with global climate norms. So what I'm going to be doing is really quickly going through the research focus and questions, the conceptual framework that I have, the methodology, my contributions to research, and my dissemination plan. So as I was explaining earlier, the first half of my PhD research really focused on the first two questions: how do cities act and who is involved? In my postdoctoral research, I am going to be focusing on the more kind of the third element of, so what, now that cities know how to act, what are the next steps that cities can do? In terms of this, I'm going to be now focusing on climate policies or the policy approaches that urban institutions take to kind of pursue climate action. In this, I'm going to be focusing on how cities are pursuing a climate action plan or a resilience strategy. In terms of the actors involved, I am going to be focusing much more on the urban institutions, especially both the bureaucratic and the political arm of the state. And finally, in terms of the next steps, I want to understand how are urban institutions really interacting with global climate norms. So in terms of my research question, the first question, or the most basic overarching question that I have is, how do urban institutions interpret and process global climate norms? And I have maybe 3 key sub-questions that help me understand these. The first thing is, do urban institutions really own their climate action plans or strategies? How do urban institutions really localize or customize these global urban climate norms? And how do urban institutions negotiate with other actors who are involved in this entire ecosystem in really shaping or framing urban climate agendas? So since I am going to be talking about norms, I felt maybe we need to understand, what do we mean by norms? And norms have been defined as a shared understanding of standard behavior. And this really is defined by socially constructed values. So norms really connect with the ideational set of thinkings. And this brings me back to my framework of state capacity that looks at how are the values and the ideas of the government or the state or the urban institution in this case really changing over time. So what I found in my PhD work was that there are some cities in the global south, like Rajkot, that have now introduced a climate action plan. So now that there is some form of thinking or kind of support for climate action at the local level, has there been a change in their mindset or the values and the beliefs? And do they have the capacity now to really negotiate and frame these globally defined climate norms? So this is what I'm going to be trying to kind of test. In terms of my methodology, I am going to be focusing on some cases that I have, and I'll also explain to you how am I going to kind of collect my data to understand my or answer my research questions and the data analysis approach that I intend to have. Very quickly, in terms of the cases, I will be focusing on cities that have not just designed, but also adopted or institutionalized a climate action plan or a climate resilience strategy. So very briefly, what does a climate action plan or a resilience strategy look like? So there are 2 elements to it. There's an evidence base that comprises of emissions inventory and projections for the future, existing climate hazards and hotspots, and the urban risk. And this is kind of the current information that there is on these cities. And then the plan really comprises of existing measures that either have an adaptation or a mitigation potential, some new adaptation and mitigation measures that can help in kind of, pursuing climate action, and finally, an implementation roadmap that also comprises of budgets. So in terms of the kind of my focus, I am going to be focusing on India, and I have listed down some of the cities in India that currently have definitely designed and adopted a climate action plan. The 4 cities that are highlighted in black are actually the cities that I'm really interested in, because they are secondary level cities, unlike Mumbai or a Bangalore or a Bengaluru, which is a mega or a large city. And a lot of research actually focuses on these bigger cities. So I'm going to try and kind of focus on the smaller cities. And the other case that I have is really Kenya, and within Kenya, again, there is Nairobi and Nakuru, which are the 2 cities that have, again, adopted a climate action plan. And what I do intend to do is, again, focus on Nakuru, which is a much smaller city as compared to Nairobi. And the 2 kind of countries or the cities have very kind of comparable elements in the fact that they're rapidly experiencing urbanization. And what is interesting for me is that the international non-governmental organizations that have been operating in India are the same organizations that are also operating in Kenya and assisting city governments in Kenya to kind of pursue a climate action plan. So in terms of my data collection process, I have two phases. The first phase really focuses on the desktop research, where I will be conducting literature review, which will really help me narrow down my cities. And it will also help me map and identify some of the key stakeholders that I would like to reach out to and connect with to understand the process and how our urban institutions really interpreting global norms. This would really lead me to the second phase of my research, kind of data collection process, which is much more field-based, where I would be conducting interviews to collect primary data, especially policy documents and meeting minutes, which are not easily available or publicly available. And this will really help me understand how our urban institutions really interacting and processing and kind of these global norms. So what does it mean for a city to actually take a climate action plan? So in terms of my data analysis, I'm going to be using a case study method. And as George and Bennett have defined, a case study method comprises of two elements. First is a within case analysis. So I will be really unpacking what's happening within these Indian cities and separately what is happening within Kenyan cities with respect to climate action plans and norms. And then the second element of a case study approach is a comparative case analysis, where I will be comparing how different cities in India are kind of interpreting global norms. And then I will also maybe compare Indian cities and Kenyan cities in terms of their interpretations of global climate norms with respect to a climate policy or a climate action plan. Very quickly, my research contributions kind of speak to different disciplines. As you can see, although I'm trained in political science and I'm using theories that really speak to political science and maybe international relations, I will be making contributions to different fields. So in terms of political science, I will be making contributions to state capacity and policymaking processes. This kind of relates to international relations, where I will be trying to develop kind of the literature on norm dynamics, and that connects to political change. Finally, I'll also be kind of contributing to climate governance literature that really focuses still on the multi-level or the network governance or the polycentric governance frameworks that really focus on the more holistic picture of the different actors involved and the interactions between these different actors. And finally, from an urban studies perspective, I will be contributing to really understanding and highlighting how urban institutions, especially from the global south that are said to have very weak capacities, how are they able to improve their capacity, and then are also maybe in some cases able to negotiate and kind of speak to these national, international, or transnational climate norms and frameworks. In terms of my research dissemination plan, I do intend to kind of speak to different audiences. So I will be kind of speaking to an academic audience through research articles and maybe a commentary piece. But I also do intend to speak to a non-academic audience, and I will be trying to nudge myself to write policy papers or briefs, and also maybe blogs and newspaper articles that has a different kind of readership. Finally, I would kind of conclude my presentation with just the references that I have used in my slides. And I look forward to your feedback and your questions for me.
All right, great. Thank you, Tanvi. We are now open for question and discussion. So I think Ling already put an example format in the chat box. For anyone who wanted to ask question, please type them in the chat box, or if you want, you can also just speak. Yeah, please write your name and affiliation if you want to type a question. Maybe while we wait for questions from the audience to come, I can take advantage of my chair's privilege to ask you maybe one conceptual, one methodological question. So I understand, based on your previous research background, I understand there must be a pragmatic element in choosing these two countries and choosing these two cities. And I also appreciate the within case analysis and the comparative analysis, that the framework that you presented. But I'm also wondering, just based on your initial research and your initial observation, what could be some interesting dimensions of comparison here, looking at this Kenyan and Indian city? And secondly, methodologically, I'm wondering, because sometimes in my own research, I also sense this discrepancy between what's written on paper and the action and practice that we witness in reality when we actually enter the field. So looking at what you just presented in terms of the research plan, I'm just wondering, in addition to the initial desktop research and looking at minutes and the paper and everything, and of course you also plan to do interview with maybe the people working in the mayor's office and that. Do you have any other channels empirically you want to explore in order to tease out some of the tensions you mentioned at the beginning? For example, the tension between economic growth and climate action.
Thank you so much, Bingchun, for the two questions. I guess I'll address the conceptual question first. I mean, in terms of comparing India versus Kenya, well, they're two kind of colonized societies. And in terms of the governance frameworks, there are some overlaps. So I feel the comparisons between these two countries will be extremely important and useful. Also because they are very, very important kind of countries or states that are increasingly contesting climate norms that have been shaped at the global level. So it would be really interesting for me now to see at the domestic, and when I say domestic, really going down to the micro level, to see that, yes, there are these similar international non-governmental organizations that are operating in India and also in Kenya. So is it really, how did these international organizations firstly choose to work in these two countries? And they have the same kind of standard operating procedure of kind of, choosing some cities and kind of convincing them that, you need to take climate action. So I really want to see whether, now that there is some kind of shared history and phenomena between these two countries, and they also have very similar domestic level governance framework. So are they also kind of negotiating with these international non-governmental organizations in a similar manner? Or is there a kind of a difference in the way they are negotiating? Because at least at the international level, these two blocks, along with some other developing countries, came together to really contest the global north, saying, you do not tell us what we need to do. We need to develop in our own ways. And you need to kind of look at climate justice, and you need to kind of have a differential kind of treatment or approach to different countries. So since they have come together, they have aligned together, they have shared kind of histories, do they also have the same negotiating kind of style, or is it slightly different? So this is, I guess, interesting for me. I really don't know whether it is going to be different or it's going to be similar. It will be really interesting for me to speak to different audiences. And that kind of then comes to the second question that you asked, is that, of course, I will need to speak with municipal governments, both the civil servants and the bureaucrats, but also the mayor's office. But what I would also firstly want to interview, my first site of inquiry would be these international non-governmental organizations, as to what are their experiences of kind of engaging with these two countries, and are they very different? So I guess I'll start from there and then kind of try and branch out to the city level or the domestic level interviews. So yes, I mean, I hope I've answered your questions.
Yes, that's great, and I like I really appreciate the climate justice dimension. I think that's a really good starting point. Okay, now we have more questions coming in through the chat box. The first one is from Nikita, who is an LSE MPA student. What are the major constraints for cities in creating climate action plans? Is it mainly financial, or is there a lack of intention or sense of urgency?
Thank you, Nikita, for this question. And thank you so much for actually joining this seminar. Well, I guess the major constraints that I found, and it's very difficult for me to generalize from all the cities, but the one city that I studied was Rajkot. And what I found was that in terms of constraints, it was really technical constraints, because climate change or climate action policy making requires you to think beyond your own sector. So you need to speak to different sectors. You need to kind of have a much more advanced understanding of how are you going to calculate your emissions, how are you going to calculate your adaptation mitigation potentials, what are the right measures, how can we kind of, so I guess to answer your question, it was much more on the technical side that the city was really lacking in capacity. But what they did was they really kind of connected with some external experts, and I call them as epistemic communities. They're basically domain experts who can try and help the state overcome this problem. They provide them new information, they provide them kind of access to certain solutions, and it's up to the state or the governments to decide how they take these actions further. In terms of financial constraints, I would say what I found interestingly was that the city government was very smart in aligning climate policies with development kind of objectives. So what it did was that when they went to the central government to ask for funds, they said, oh, we're doing a development project. We are going to be kind of improving our water supplies. It just has a climate alignment, or it does have a climate adaptation potential or a mitigation potential, which kind of aligns with our existing development objective. So, why don't you fund us to do the same thing that we would in general have done? We're just adding an additional lens. So I think the financial constraints were really not a major concern. Of course, if there is more financial support, they will be able to really upscale the interventions they are doing, and they will do it at a much faster pace, I guess. So that's the kind of constraints that they do have. And in terms of a sense of intention and urgency, I think it varies from city to city. Some cities are extremely aware and conscious about climate change measures, so they are really self-motivated and they want to kind of take climate action and also really interact, not just at a national level, but also at an international level. They want to kind of go to these international conventions and show to the world that this is what we are doing and maybe we can learn from each other. So I guess in some cases, there is a sense of urgency or a sense of self-motivation as well within these urban institutions. I hope I've addressed all your questions.
Yeah, the next question is from Denise at Grantham Institute. Wondering about your what next concern following on from your PhD research, and how your research could be applied at some point to smaller developing countries which face many challenges in developing capacity to pursue urban climate action or policy.
Thank you so much, Denise, for joining. I really, really appreciate this. And yes, your question is extremely valid. I guess I focused on India and Kenya purely from a pragmatic perspective, is because from my PhD research, I do have some contacts within India, which I will be kind of able to build on right now to do my research. And from my previous kind of postdoc experience, I also have some contacts in Kenya. So I guess these choices were much more from a pragmatic perspective, saying, yes, I can kind of tap into my existing resources and do some research. And then I guess going forward, I would definitely like to test out my framework to kind of understand how are the smaller developing countries, which definitely need much more focus and are still understudied, whether my framework can really apply to these other countries as well. I mean, that was the plan, but I guess it's a future ambition for me.
The next question is from Zheyi Zhang, an LSE master student. Will interaction with global norm create climate justice in the global south? And if there's inequality between urban and rural population in terms of policy cost and the benefits?
Good gosh, that's a very tough question. Thank you so much for the question. Definitely, I think interacting with global climate norms, especially for developing countries, is a big question of climate justice. And what I do want to at least explore in my research is that these developing the developed countries are kind of funding a lot of the research kind of to, have a plan and also support these international non-governmental organizations to really assist city governments to pursue a plan. So if you see, it's not just a flow of money, it's also a flow of knowledge. So it's a flow of frameworks or norms that are actually shaped, again, in the global north. And then they are being kind of passed on to the global south. So now I really want to see whether these frameworks that are global climate frameworks, how much are the global south able to really question them and also maybe influence them in some way possible? Because at the local level, there are so many kind of interventions and policy innovations that are emerging. So the urban institutions in the developing countries can actually be norm entrepreneurs who can really shape these global norms. So I'm really going to be testing out whether this is actually happening in any of the cities. In terms of the second question about the inequalities between urban and rural populations, well, I guess that's really not within the scope of my area of research, because maybe in my PhD work, I could have looked at it, but I really wanted to just focus on the urban. And in my current research, I'm now going to be looking at how the urban really interacts with a higher level of governance at the transnational or the international level. So I guess this would really be within the scope of my, outside the scope of my research. Okay.
And we have two questions from Neha, who is an LSE MPP student. The first one is, as the focus is on climate response and interpretation, are you planning to treat them based on the climate risk? Their targets and the robustness of the action plan might be driven by the risk. And secondly, speaking about India, some of the plans are a prerequisite to get access to the federal funding, which might not mandate cities to implement the plan. Will this local context affect your interpretation of the urban response?
Thank you, Neha, for that question. Well, I must mention that Neha is an expert on urban issues in India, and she's got a decade-long experience. So I guess I understand the questions and the depth of those questions. Well, I'll answer the first question as a focus. Yes, am I going to be looking at climate risk? You very rightly pointed out each climate policy that has been designed for different cities, they need to be customized to the local risks that are kind of prevalent in those cities. So just to give you an example, some cities might have a water issue, but that does not mean that they will just focus on water issues. They will also look at all the other risks that that city has faced. So in terms of the climate risk, there might be some focused interventions, but these climate action plans are really supposed to be comprehensive, that speak to different sectors, not one particular sector, and that also kind of look at both adaptation mitigation potentials. So the targets, okay, yeah, definitely their targets and everything is driven by risk, but they are also trying to the frameworks are also designed in a way that they are trying to make the entire urban system. So it's thinking of a systems thinking rather than a sector or a crisis. So they're saying, how does that entire city become robust or resilient against any future or current climate threat? So it will not just focus on one particular crisis, it will try and look at different crises as well, and how also they interact with each other. And in terms of India, actually, I mean, I would say that in terms of the second question, India does not have a mandate to have an urban climate policy. So there is no prerequisite for India actually to make for Indian cities to make a climate action plan. This is really the willingness of certain municipal governments to do this on their own accord. And I think this is interesting for me also to kind of tweak into saying, why are you doing it? They get federal funding to do developmental projects. They don't get federal funding to do climate specific projects. And I would really urge you to kind of not get confused between the smart cities program that India has, because that smart cities program is still targeting infrastructure development oriented projects. They are really not climate specific projects. So I would definitely urge you to look into these climate action plans that have been designed and how they're slightly different, and they really do not help or benefit the cities in any way possible to get federal funding. So yeah, I don't think the second question is something that I can really answer.
Do we have any more questions? I have to say though, even though we don't have a huge audience, but I think these are all extremely, valid and sort of insightful questions.
Absolutely. I hope I was able to kind of share something that was interesting to you. And I do understand that we all work across different disciplines. So I hope you were learn something new, but I also definitely learned something from all the questions that you have asked. So thank you so much for your questions.
Okay, if there are no more questions from the floor, I'm just going to say a few things before I bring today's session to an end. First of all, this is something that Ling reminded me, but I still forgot to mention at the beginning. The seminar has been recorded and it will become available on the Hub's SPP, the website. And another reminder is that, as I mentioned, this is our regular lunchtime seminar series. So we'll have more exciting events coming in the winter term. We already decided to host the book launch for Dr. Yifei Yan at Southampton, and she recently published a new book looking at which is a comparative study of education policy in China and India. So that's one of the exciting events we are hosting next term. So do watch this space, and I'm sure some of you have already signed up for the SPP newsletter, and if you haven't done so, I do encourage you to do that, because that's where we advertise all these future events. And with that, I think let's thank Tanvi again for a wonderful presentation and also for a very dynamic Q&A. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Bingchun. And thank you everyone for participating.